There is a pattern governments follow when debt becomes unpayable. Not default, not austerity, not taxation. Something far more sophisticated. They manipulate the currency itself. They change what money means. They rewrite the rules of value. And in doing so, they transfer the burden from government balance sheets to citizens' bank accounts. Quietly, legally, completely. This has happened 3 times in the last century. 1933, the gold revaluation. 1971, the Nixon Shock. 2008 through 2025, the quantitative easing era. 3 different methods, same outcome. Government debt reduced, citizens' wealth destroyed. And right now, with the United States carrying $37 trillion in debt, the pattern is repeating. Not as conspiracy, as policy. Visible policy. The same sequence playing out again. Let me show you exactly how this works.
In 1933, the United States was drowning in debt. World War I had cost billions. The Great Depression destroyed tax revenues. Banks were collapsing. The debt-to-GDP ratio had climbed to 40%, and the government had no way to pay it back. They were trapped. So President Franklin Roosevelt did something that had never been done before in American history. He confiscated gold from American citizens and then revalued it by 69% overnight. Here's how the mechanism worked. Since 1879, the United States had been on a gold standard. $1 was defined as 1/20th of an ounce of gold. Gold was officially priced at $20.67 per ounce. Fixed. Unchanging. Your dollar was literally a receipt for physical gold stored in government vaults. But the government was broke, and they couldn't pay their debts at the current gold price. So Roosevelt changed the math. On April 5, 1933, he issued Executive Order 6102. The order made it illegal for American citizens to own gold. You had 25 days to turn in your gold or face 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. Most Americans complied. They brought their gold to banks. They were paid $20.67 per ounce. They received paper dollars in exchange. What they didn't know was what came next. After the government collected the gold, Roosevelt announced the revaluation. In January 1934, the official price of gold was changed to $35 per ounce, a 69% increase. The government now owned most of the nation's gold. At the old price, their reserves were worth $4 billion. At the new price, $6.8 billion. They had created $2.8 billion in value out of thin air, just by declaring gold was worth more. But here's what that really meant. The debt was still denominated in dollars, but those dollars were now worth less relative to gold. Before the revaluation, the debt burden was 40% of GDP. Within 5 years, the real debt burden had fallen to 25% of GDP. They had erased 15 percentage points of debt to GDP without paying a single dollar back. But someone paid. American citizens who had turned in their gold at $20.67 watched the government revalue it to $35. They couldn't buy it back. Owning gold was illegal until 1974. They were stuck holding paper dollars that were losing purchasing power, while the government used their confiscated gold to erase debt. The people who had saved in gold, who had trusted the system, they were the ones who paid for the government's debt elimination, through theft disguised as monetary policy.
Now let me show you the second time this pattern appeared. 1971. The United States was once again drowning in debt. The Vietnam War had cost hundreds of billions. Social programs were expanding, and the country was still technically on a gold standard. The Bretton Woods system. Under Bretton Woods, the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Other countries' currencies were pegged to the dollar, and foreign governments could exchange dollars for gold. This created a problem. The United States was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. By 1971, there were $70 billion in circulation held by foreign governments, but the U.S. only had about $10 billion worth of gold in reserves. If every foreign government demanded their gold, the system would collapse. France figured this out first. Charles de Gaulle didn't trust American monetary policy. He saw the U.S. printing money to finance war and spending. So in 1965, France began converting dollars to gold. Other countries followed: Germany, Switzerland, Britain. Gold was flowing out of Fort Knox. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon made an announcement. He closed the gold window. The United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at any price. The link between the dollar and gold was severed. The Bretton Woods system collapsed, and the world moved to a pure fiat currency system where dollars were backed by nothing except the government's promise. What happened next was predictable. Without gold backing, the government could print as much money as it wanted. And it did. The 1970s became the decade of inflation. The dollar lost half its purchasing power by 1980. Oil prices quadrupled. Food prices doubled. Wages couldn't keep up. American savings evaporated in real terms. But the government's debt was now being repaid in devalued dollars. Creditors who had lent money in 1960 were being repaid in 1975 with dollars worth half as much. The government had once again eliminated debt burden through currency manipulation. And once again, savers and creditors paid the price. Now let me show you the third iteration of this pattern, and this one is still happening. 2008, the financial crisis. The housing market collapsed. Lehman Brothers failed. The Federal Reserve responded with something unprecedented: quantitative easing. The Fed began buying government bonds and mortgage-backed securities using newly created money. From 2008 to 2014, the Fed's balance sheet expanded from $800 billion to $4.5 trillion. They created $3.7 trillion out of nothing. Then came 2020, the pandemic. The economy shut down. And the Fed did it again. From 2020 to 2022, they created another $4.5 trillion. The Fed's balance sheet peaked at $9 trillion. In total, over $8 trillion created in 14 years, more money than existed in the entire U.S. economy in 1990. This was money printing on a scale never seen in peacetime. And the stated reason was to stabilize the economy, to prevent deflation, to support markets. But here's the real effect. The government's debt grew from $10 trillion in 2008 to $37 trillion today. But the value of that debt in real terms shrank because the Fed was buying the bonds with newly created money. They were monetizing the debt. When you owe $10 trillion and you print $8 trillion, you've effectively reduced your debt burden by devaluing the currency. The inflation that followed from 2020 to 2024 was not an accident. It was the mechanism. Inflation ran at 8% officially, likely higher in reality. Over 4 years, the dollar lost 25% of its purchasing power. That means debt, denominated in dollars, became 25% cheaper to repay in real terms.
The government borrowed in 2008 dollars and is repaying in 2024 dollars that are worth far less. And here's the key insight. All three of these events, 1933, 1971, and 2008 to 2025, used different methods but achieved the same goal: debt reduction through currency devaluation. In 1933, they confiscated gold and revalued it. In 1971, they broke the gold link and inflated. In 2008 to 2025, they printed money directly and called it quantitative easing. The names change, the justifications evolve, but the pattern remains. Government accumulates unpayable debt. Government manipulates the currency. Debt burden reduced. Citizens' wealth transferred.
The United States currently owes $37 trillion. The debt-to-GDP ratio is 132%, the highest in American history outside of World War II. The annual interest payment on that debt is now $1.2 trillion, more than the defense budget, more than Medicare. Interest payments alone consume 6% of GDP. This is mathematically unsustainable. You cannot tax your way out of 132% debt to GDP. You cannot cut spending when entitlements and interest are mandatory. You cannot grow fast enough when demographics work against you. Every economist knows this. The debt cannot be repaid through traditional means. So what are the options? Default. Declare bankruptcy. This destroys the government's credibility permanently. This is unacceptable to those in power. Austerity. Cut spending dramatically. Raise taxes significantly. But this is political suicide. Austerity has never happened voluntarily in the United States. Or devaluation. Manipulate the currency. Reduce the real value of debt without formally defaulting. This is the option governments always choose, because it's the path of least political resistance. This brings us to what's happening right now. In January 2025, President Trump signed an executive order establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve. The order directs the Treasury to acquire and hold Bitcoin as a strategic asset. The U.S. government already holds approximately 210,000 Bitcoin seized from criminal cases. At current prices, around $100,000 per Bitcoin, that's $21 billion. The proposed target is 1 million Bitcoin over 5 years. Now here's where it gets interesting from a pattern perspective. If you're accumulating a strategic reserve of an asset, there are only two reasons to do it. Either you believe the asset will appreciate significantly in value, or you're planning to revalue it yourself. The 1933 playbook was accumulate gold, then revalue it to create balance sheet value. The question is whether the same playbook applies to Bitcoin. On the gold side, the United States officially holds 8,133 tons of gold, about 261 million ounces. At current prices, around $2,800 per ounce, that's worth $731 billion. But here's the strange thing. That gold is valued on the government's official books at $42.22 per ounce. On paper, the U.S. gold reserve is worth only $11 billion. They're holding an asset worth $731 billion and accounting for it at $11 billion. Look at the setup. The government holds massive gold reserves valued
at 1970s prices. They're now establishing Bitcoin reserves. Central banks globally are buying record amounts of gold. China, Russia, India, all accumulating. The BRICS nations are discussing gold-backed currency alternatives to the dollar. The pieces are being positioned. What I am showing you is the pattern. When governments face unpayable debt, they manipulate the currency using whatever tools are available. In 1933, the tool was gold revaluation. In 1971,
The tool was breaking the gold standard. In 2008 to 2025, the tool was quantitative easing. Today, the conversation has shifted to Bitcoin reserves and gold backing. The tools evolve, but the pattern remains. What happens in the next phase of this pattern is already visible. It's not dramatic, it's not sudden, it's inflation. The kind of inflation we've already seen from 2020 to 2024, except sustained over a longer period. 5 to 7% inflation annually for 10 to 15 years compounds to devastating purchasing power loss. If inflation runs at 6% per year for 12 years, the dollar loses half its value. That means anyone holding dollars, bonds, or fixed income assets loses half their wealth. But debt denominated in dollars becomes half as expensive to repay in real terms. The government doesn't need to announce a reset. They just need to let inflation run while keeping interest rates below the inflation rate. This is called financial repression. You put money in a savings account earning 2%, while inflation runs at 6%. You're losing 4% per year in purchasing power. That's a tax, a hidden tax. But it's exactly how governments reduce debt burdens. The reason Bitcoin and gold are relevant is because they're the assets people flee to when they realize currency is being devalued. If you understand the pattern, you understand that holding assets that can't be printed, that have fixed supply or physical scarcity, preserves wealth better than holding currency. Gold has 5,000 years of history as money. Bitcoin has 16 years as digital scarcity. Neither can be created by government decree. That's why they hold value when currencies don't. This is not conspiracy. This is the documented historical pattern. 1933, confiscate gold, revalue it, devalue the dollar, erase debt. 1971, break gold backing, inflate currency, reduce debt burden. 2008 to 2025, print trillions, create inflation, reduce real debt value. The pattern suggests the next phase is already underway. The only question is the timeline and the scale. Here's what you need to understand about this pattern. It's not about predicting exact prices or dates. It's about recognizing the sequence. Unpayable debt, currency manipulation, wealth transfer from savers to debtors. This has happened 3 times in modern history. Each time, the people holding currency lost wealth. Each time, the people holding hard assets preserved wealth. Each time, the government survived while creditors and savers were destroyed. The 4th iteration of this pattern is in progress. The debt is 37 trillion. The interest is unpayable. The options are limited. History says devaluation is the choice. The tools are being assembled. Strategic reserves, digital asset leadership, gold backing discussions. These are the justifications that will be used when the devaluation accelerates. You can't stop this pattern. It's driven by political incentives stronger than any individual. But you can position yourself on the right side of it. The pattern is clear. Holding currency when governments are trapped in debt is the losing position.
Holding assets with intrinsic value or fixed supply is the winning position. Gold, Bitcoin, productive real estate, commodities. These are the assets that survive currency manipulation because they exist outside the currency system. The pattern is repeating, not because of conspiracy, because of mathematics and incentives. The debt is unpayable. The government will not default. The only option left is devaluation. The tools are visible. The historical precedent is clear. The question is whether you'll recognize the pattern before it completes. Because by the time it's obvious to everyone, it's too late to protect yourself. The wealth transfer has already happened. Subscribe to track the pattern. The same sequence that destroyed savers in 1933, 1971, and 2008 through 2025 is in motion again. And the only people who survive are the ones who see it coming.